My son-in-law stood in the hallway of my own house and told me I was too old to understand how modern real estate worked. I didn't yell. I didn't remind him whose name was on the deed. I just called an electrician. 72 hours later, his entire financial facade completely and permanently collapsed. Before we get into how that happened, drop a comment down below and tell me where in the world you are tuning in from today. I always love seeing where this community is listening from. My name is Patricia Coyle, 69 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a superintendent at a regional power plant. People think electricity is magic. It isn't. It is just controlled pressure. In a power grid, a catastrophic failure never happens instantly. It is always preceded by 1,000 tiny, invisible overloads. A frayed wire here, a bypass safety switch there. I spent my entire adult life monitoring those overloads, making sure the grid held. I really should have recognized those same warning signs in my own family. When you retire, things get quiet. Sometimes, too quiet. You start noticing things, like the way my son-in-law, Marcus, talked about money. 5 years ago, I let Marcus and my daughter, Chloe, move into a suburban property I bought as an investment. The deal was simple. They live there rent-free. They save up for their own place. I kept the original deed locked in a safe at my lawyer's office. But lately, Marcus was acting like a landlord. When I pulled up to the house that Tuesday afternoon, the first thing I saw was the contrast. My beat-up, 10-year-old pickup truck parked right next to Marcus's spotless, slate-gray BMW in the driveway. The driveway I paved, the property I paid taxes on every single year. He always looked at my truck like it was an eyesore, like it didn't belong in this upscale neighborhood. He forgot who bought the neighborhood for him. Chloe was out of town on a business trip. Marcus was supposed to be at his investment firm. I had just stopped by to check on a strange humming sound Chloe had casually mentioned on the phone. I walked inside. The house was dead quiet, but the walls felt alive. That is the only way I can describe it. When you work around high voltage for 4 decades, you feel the current in your teeth. I walked down the hall to the utility room. The air smelled faintly of warm copper and dust. I placed my calloused hand against the cold steel of the main breaker box. It was vibrating. A deep, angry hum. The kind of sound a system makes right before it trips. The main breaker was hot to the touch. The house was pulling a massive amount of juice. Way more than a single empty house with the lights off should be pulling. I didn't guess. I didn't assume. I picked up my phone and called Gary, a master electrician I had known for 20 years. "Gary," I said, "I need you to come take a look at a panel. Something is pulling a massive load, and it is not coming from the main floor." I thought I was just fixing a wiring issue. I had no idea I was about to unplug my son-in-law's entire life. Let me take you back a little bit, because to understand the absolute audacity of what Marcus was doing, you need to understand the foundation he built his ego on. And I mean that literally. I bought that foundation. 5 years ago, Chloe came to me in tears. They were living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in the city. The rent kept going up. Marcus was trying to get his boutique investment firm off the ground, playing the part of a high roller while drowning in credit card debt. He needed to look successful to attract clients, but they were barely scraping by. Chloe was exhausted. She was working 60 hours a week just to keep the lights on, while Marcus took clients to expensive dinners he could not afford. I hated seeing my daughter like that. I had spent 40 years at the power plant working swing shifts, climbing steel ladders in the freezing rain, banking my overtime, so my family would never have to panic about money. I had savings, significant savings. So, I found a beautiful, four-bedroom house in a quiet, upscale suburb. It had a wraparound porch, a big backyard, and a finished basement with a separate side entrance. It was a solid house. Good bones. I paid in cash. I walked into my lawyer Grant's office, signed the paperwork, and locked the original deed in his fireproof safe. The arrangement I offered them was incredibly generous, too generous. Looking back, I told them they could live in the house rent-free. No mortgage, no rent, all they had to cover were their own utility bills. The goal was for them to save every penny they would normally spend on housing so they could eventually buy their own place. Every single November for the last 5 years, I personally paid the $8,000 property tax bill. I never asked them for a dime. You would think that kind of gift would make a man humble. But Marcus was not wired for humility. He was wired for appearance. Within 6 months of moving in, Marcus stopped talking about the house as a temporary stepping stone. He started calling it his property. He started hosting lavish weekend barbecues for his potential investors. Standing on the mahogany deck I paid to have restored, flipping steaks, and talking about the equity he was building in the neighborhood. I never corrected him in front of his guests. I let him have his pride. That was my mistake. In a power grid, when you bypass a safety mechanism because it is inconvenient, you are just guaranteeing a fire later on. By letting Marcus pretend he owned the house, I let him believe his own lie. He started looking down on me. He hated when I visited in my old work clothes. He hated my beat-up truck in the driveway. He wanted me to be a silent, invisible ghost who simply bankrolled his lifestyle. But the house was not a ghost. The house was talking to me right now. I stood in the utility room, listening to the angry hum of the electrical panel. A few minutes later, I heard the crunch of gravel outside. Gary had arrived. Gary is a master electrician. We worked together at the plant for 20 years. He is a man of very few words, mostly because he prefers the company of copper wiring to human beings. He walked through the front door carrying his heavy canvas tool bag, wiped his boots on the mat, and gave me a curt nod. I led him straight to the utility closet. I did not have to say anything. As soon as we stepped into the hallway, Gary stopped. He tilted his head. He heard the vibration. 2. He opened the metal door of the panel. He pulled a digital multimeter from his bag and clamped it around the main incoming wire. He stared at the reading for a long time. Then he looked at me. "Patty," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Chloe is out of town." "Right? She is in Chicago for 3 days." I said, "And Marcus is at work? He should be at his office downtown. The house is completely empty." Gary tapped the screen of his meter. "This main breaker is pulling 65 amps continuously. That is not a refrigerator running. That is not an air conditioner cycling on. You have got a massive, constant draw happening somewhere on this property. If this keeps up, the breaker is going to trip. Or worse, melt the bus bar." He started flipping the individual circuit breakers one by one, watching his meter. The lights in the kitchen went out. The load did not drop. He flipped the living room, the bedrooms, the bathrooms. The load stayed exactly the same. Finally, his hand stopped over a double-pole breaker at the very bottom of the panel. It was labeled in Marcus's messy handwriting. The label just said storage. Gary flipped it off. Instantly, the deep, vibrating hum in the wall stopped. The house fell completely silent. The heavy electrical pressure vanished from the air. Gary looked at his meter. The power draw had dropped to almost zero. "Well," Gary said, packing his meter back into his bag, Whatever is eating all your power is on that circuit. Where does that run? The basement? I said. I turned around and walked down the hallway toward the door that led to the basement stairs. The door that was supposed to be unlocked. The door that led to the empty storage space. I reached out and turned the brass knob. It did not move. It was locked solid. And it was not just a normal lock. Mounted right above the handle was a brand new, high-end digital keypad. A heavy-duty deadbolt that I certainly had not installed. I stood there, staring at the glowing blue numbers on the keypad. A cold, quiet clarity washed over me. Marcus had not just claimed my house in his mind. He had physically locked me out of a piece of it. I stood in the hallway, staring at the glowing blue numbers of the digital keypad. The basement door was a heavy, solid wood interior door. But Marcus had outfitted it with a deadbolt that looked like it belonged on the back entrance of a jewelry store. Gary walked up behind me. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the lock. "You have the code for this." "Patty?" he asked. "No. Gary." I said, "I do not have the code. I did not even know this lock existed until about 10 seconds ago." Gary did not ask any more questions. He is a professional at... He just looked at the door, then looked at me. "Do you want to call Marcus and ask him for the combination? If we need to get down there to check the wiring, we need that door open." I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I looked at Marcus's contact name on the screen, and then I put the phone right back into my pocket. In a power plant, if you are doing a routine inspection and you find an unauthorized bypass, a wire routed around a safety valve, or a locked door where there is supposed to be open access, you do not call the guy who installed it to ask him why he did it. You do not tip him off. You isolate the system. You cut the power. And you investigate it yourself. "No," I said quietly. "I am not calling Marcus. Gary, leave that breaker turned off. I do not want whatever is down there pulling another amp of my electricity. I am calling a locksmith." Gary just nodded. "I will go out to the truck and grab a coffee. Take your time." I called a local 24-hour locksmith because it was the middle of a Tuesday. He said he could be there in 20 minutes. While I waited, I stood in the kitchen. I did not sit down. I just stood by the island, listening to the absolute silence of the house. With that one breaker turned off, the aggressive, vibrating hum in the walls was completely gone. 20 minutes later, a young guy in a branded polo shirt knocked on the front door. He carried a heavy metal toolbox. I led him to the basement door and pointed at the digital keypad. "I need this opened," I said. "I am the owner of the property. I have my driver's license and a digital copy of the deed right here on my phone if you need to see it." The locksmith waved his hand. "If you are letting me in the front door, lady, that is usually proof enough." He leaned in and inspected the lock. "This is a high-security residential model. It has anti-pick pins. I cannot just pop it with a tension wrench. I am going to have to drill out the cylinder. It will ruin the lock. Are you okay with that? Drill it?" I said. He pulled a heavy-duty Makita drill from his bag, attached a titanium bit, and pressed it directly into the keyhole below the keypad. The sound was deafening. High-pitched metal grinding against metal. Shavings of brass and steel fell onto the hardwood floor. It took him nearly 5 minutes of solid, aggressive drilling before something inside the mechanism gave way with a loud snap. He pulled the drill back, took a heavy flathead screwdriver, inserted it into the mangled hole, and turned it. The heavy deadbolt slid back with a dull thud. I paid him in cash, thanked him, and showed him to the front door. Once he was gone, I walked back to the hallway. I reached out and turned the brass handle. The door swung open, I expected to smell the musty, a slightly damp scent of an unfinished storage basement. I expected to see cardboard boxes stacked in the dark. Instead, a rush of cool, air-conditioned air hit my face. It smelled like fabric softener and expensive vanilla candles. I reached around the corner and flipped the light switch. A row of recessed LED lights illuminated the stairwell. I walked down the wooden stairs, my boots making soft thuds. When I reached the bottom, I stopped. I actually forgot to breathe for a moment. The basement was entirely gone. In its place was a beautiful, fully finished studio apartment. There was expensive gray laminate flooring, a small but modern kitchenette with a stainless steel refrigerator and a portable induction stove, a queen-size bed pushed against the far wall, covered in a neat gray duvet, a flat-screen television mounted on the wall, and sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a thick medical textbook to his chest like a shield, was a young man in his early 20s. He was wearing green hospital scrubs. He looked absolutely terrified. "Please don't call the police," he said, his voice shaking. "I swear I paid the rent. I gave the envelope to Marcus yesterday. I don't know why the power went out, but I am paid up through the end of the month." I did not raise my voice. I did not move toward him. I just stood at the bottom of the stairs, processing the absolute, undeniable reality of what I was looking at. "What is your name?" I asked, keeping my voice as gentle as I could. "Liam." He stammered. "I am a second-year medical student. I rent this place." "Who are you?" "My name is Patricia." I said, "I am Marcus's mother-in-law, and I am the owner of this house." "Liam, how long have you lived down here?" He swallowed hard. 2 years. Ever since I started my residency rotations at the hospital down the road. "And how much do you pay Marcus every month?" $1,800, Liam said quickly. "In cash." He said he prefers cash because it keeps the accounting simple. $1,800 a month. For 24 months, that was over $43,000. Untaxed, unreported, pulled directly out of the equity of my property, while I paid the property taxes and let him live upstairs for free. Marcus had not just claimed my house. He had monetized it. He had turned my generosity into a secret, off-the-books business. And he was using my electrical grid to power it. I looked at Liam. The poor kid was shaking, thinking he was being evicted by a loan shark. "Liam," I said softly, "you are not in trouble. The power went out because the main breaker is overloaded. My electrician is going to come down here in a minute and run a temporary line so your refrigerator doesn't spoil." I turned around and looked back up the stairs. The anger I felt was not hot. It was freezing cold. It was the absolute, unassailable clarity of knowing exactly what needed to be dismantled. I walked fully into the basement apartment, letting the reality of the space sink in. It was not just a slapped-together room. It was a complete, professional renovation. Drywall, crown molding, a fully tiled bathroom in the corner. Someone had spent serious money down here to turn my storage space into a high-end rental unit, and Marcus was reaping every single benefit of it. Liam was still clutching his heavy medical textbook, looking at me like I was going to throw him out onto the street. He was just a kid trying to get through his residency. He was a victim in this, too. "Liam," I said, keeping my voice very steady and very calm. I meant what I said. "You are not being evicted today, but I need to understand exactly what is going on here. Do you have a lease?" He nodded quickly. He set his book down on the bed, walked over to a small desk, and pulled a manila folder from the drawer. His hands were shaking a little as he handed it to me. I opened the folder. Inside was a standard, pre-printed residential lease agreement. I scanned the first page. There it was, in black and white. Marcus had listed his own name under the section labeled Property Owner. He had forged my authority on a legal document to lease out a property he did not own, secretly collecting $1,800 in untaxed cash every single month for 2 solid years. "How do you pay him?" I asked. Looking up from the paper, "You said you pay in cash. Does he give you a receipt?" Liam flipped to the back of the folder. "I keep a ledger," he explained nervously. "Because it is cash. I wanted to make sure I had proof I paid him. Every month on the 1st, I hand him the envelope, and he signs his initials next to the date right here." I looked at the simple ruled notebook paper. 24 months. 24 neat little signatures in Marcus's distinct, arrogant handwriting. It was a perfectly documented paper trail of his own fraud. "Thank you, Liam," I said. I pulled my phone from my pocket and took clear, focused pictures of the lease agreement and every single page of that ledger. "This stays between us for now. Please do not tell Marcus that we had this conversation." Just then, heavy footsteps came down the wooden stairs. Gary walked in, carrying his heavy tool bag. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the finished apartment. "Well," Gary said, his voice a low rumble. "This explains the power draw." He did not ask questions about the tenant. He just went straight to work. He pulled a small step stool from the kitchenette, climbed up, and pushed aside one of the drop-ceiling tiles. He clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight and shined it into the dark space between the joists. I watched his face change. Gary is a man who has seen industrial electrical fires melt solid steel. He does not scare easily, but his jaw tightened, and he let out a hard, sharp breath. "Patty," he said quietly, "come look at this." I climbed up onto the stool next to him and looked where the beam of his flashlight was pointing. It was a disaster. Marcus had not hired a professional to wire this basement. He had done it himself. Or hired some cheap, unlicensed handyman to do it under the table. Thick black wires were illegally spliced into the main line, held together with nothing but cheap plastic wire nuts and black electrical tape. There was no sub-panel. There were no safety breakers. He had just piggybacked an entire apartment's worth of electricity, a refrigerator, a stove, the heating elements directly onto a single circuit meant for a few light bulbs. "This is not just code violation," Gary said, stepping down. "This is a fire waiting to happen. The wires up there are physically warm to the touch. If this kid turns on the stove and the microwave at the same time, the insulation on those wires is going to melt. It will burn the house down from the inside out. In a power plant, we call that a critical bypass. It is when someone intentionally disables a safety mechanism just to keep the machine running a little faster, a little cheaper. They think they are being clever. They think they have beat the system. Until the day the pressure builds, the sparks fly, and the whole facility goes up in smoke." Marcus had bypassed every safety rule in the book to fund his lifestyle. "Can you make it safe for tonight?" I asked Gary. "Just enough so Liam can keep his lights on and his food from spoiling? I can run a heavy-duty extension cord from an isolated circuit upstairs just for his fridge and a lamp," Gary said. "But I am leaving that main basement breaker off. Permanently. I am not turning that back on until this entire ceiling is ripped out and rewired." "Do it," I said. I thanked Liam again, told him to study hard, and walked back up the stairs. Gary finished his temporary fix, packed up his tools, and left. He did not charge me for the emergency call. He just patted my shoulder and told me to be careful. I locked the front door. I walked into the kitchen and sat down on one of the expensive leather bar stools that Marcus had bought. I did not turn on the television. I did not make myself a cup of tea. I just sat in the quiet house, waiting. It was almost 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Chloe was out of town. Marcus was scheduled to come home from his quote-unquote investment firm at any minute. I watched through the front window as the sun began to dip behind the tall oak trees in the yard. A few minutes later, the smooth, quiet engine of a slate-gray BMW turned into my driveway. The tires crunched on the gravel. The driver's side door opened. Marcus was home. I watched through the front window as Marcus walked up the driveway. He was wearing a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than the first car I ever bought. He carried a sleek leather briefcase, walking with that heavy, self-important stride of a man who believes he absolutely owns the ground he is stepping on. His polished leather shoes clicked loudly against the concrete. He unlocked the front door and walked into the foyer. He did not call out a greeting. He just tossed his keys onto the console table and loosened his expensive silk tie. Then, he noticed me. I was standing at the end of the hallway, right next to the splintered basement door. He stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes flicked from my face down to the brass shavings scattered across the hardwood floor, and then to the drilled-out digital keypad. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine panic flash across his face. It was the look of a parasite realizing the host has woken up. But Marcus is a professional manipulator. He recovers quickly. Instead of apologizing, instead of explaining why he had secretly renovated my basement and moved a stranger into it, he went on the immediate, aggressive offensive. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp and echoing in the quiet hallway. He marched toward me, using his height to loom over me. "And what the hell did you do to my door?" "It is my door." "Marcus," I said quietly, keeping my hands resting casually in the pockets of my jeans. And I had a locksmith drill it open so my electrician could figure out why this house was pulling enough amperage to melt the main breaker. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair and looked down at me with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "You called a locksmith?" he sneered, shaking his head slowly. "You are unbelievable. Listen to me very carefully. You are Patricia Coyle, a 69-year-old retired woman who spends her days gardening and watching daytime television. You do not understand how modern real estate works. You do not understand how passive income works. I am building equity for my family. And you are down here breaking my property because you got confused by a tripped breaker." There it was. He actually used my full name and my age as a weapon to diminish me. He wanted to paint me as a frail, confused elderly woman who was just getting in the way of his financial brilliance. "Your property?" I asked. My voice did not rise. It stayed perfectly level, barely above a whisper. "You have a tenant living in my basement, paying you $1,800 a month in cash, on a property that I own, a property that I pay the property taxes on every single November." He did not even blink. The sheer arrogance of the man was staggering. "This is my house," he said, stepping even closer, trying to force me to back away. I did not move a single inch. "Chloe and I live here. We manage it. I monetized an unused space to provide for my family because that is what a real provider does. Something you clearly cannot comprehend with your outdated, blue-collar mindset. Do not come into my home and start poking around things you do not have the mental capacity to understand. You are an old woman. Go home. I will have a contractor fix the door tomorrow, and I will be sending you the bill." I did not scream. I did not slap him across his smug face. I did not pull out my phone and show him the photographs of his illegal lease agreement and the 24 months of cash receipts that were sitting in my camera roll in a power plant. When a massive turbine is spinning out of control and shaking the foundation, You do not stand in front of it and yell at it to stop. You do not argue with a machine that is tearing itself apart. You step back behind the reinforced blast wall. You let it keep spinning. And you quietly walk down to the control room and shut off the main fuel valve. I looked down at his wrist. He was wearing a heavy gold Rolex, a watch bought with the untaxed cash he was pulling directly out of the equity of my house. "Okay, Marcus," I said softly. I saw the tension instantly drain out of his shoulders. He let out a long, dramatic sigh and adjusted his cuffs. He genuinely believed he had won. He mistook my quietness for absolute surrender. He thought he had successfully bullied a confused widow into submission. The undeniable relief on his face was almost comical. "Good," he said, his voice dropping back to that smooth, condescending tone he used with his wealthy clients. "Now, if you will excuse me. I have a massive networking dinner to prepare for this weekend. My firm is hosting a major event right here in the backyard. Try not to cause any more disasters while I am working to secure our future." He turned his back on me. He actually turned his back on the woman who owned the roof over his head, walked into the kitchen, and poured himself a glass of expensive scotch. He was celebrating. He was standing in a house he did not own, drinking liquor bought with stolen money, celebrating a victory that did not exist. I did not say another word. I turned around, walked out the front door, and got into my beat-up pickup truck. I turned the key in the ignition. I did not drive home. I drove straight toward downtown. I was going to see my lawyer. I drove downtown in absolute silence. I did not turn on the radio. I just listened to the steady hum of my truck's engine and watched the streetlights pass overhead. As I drove, I could picture Marcus perfectly. I knew exactly what he was doing back at the house. He was probably standing in my kitchen, sipping his expensive scotch, feeling a profound sense of relief. He genuinely believed he had won. He thought that because I did not scream, because I did not throw a fit, I had simply backed down in a power plant. We have a term for that. We call it a blind monitor. It is when a pressure gauge gets stuck in the green zone, so the operator thinks everything is running perfectly fine, while the actual pressure inside the tank is building to catastrophic levels. Marcus was staring at a blind monitor. He mistook my silence for surrender. He thought I was just a tired 69-year-old widow who did not have the energy or the intellect to fight him. He had no idea that I was not retreating. I was just walking to the control room to flip the main kill switch. 30 minutes later, I pulled into the underground parking garage of a very quiet, very expensive building in the downtown financial district. I took the elevator to the 12th floor. The doors opened to a reception area with dark wood paneling and the smell of expensive coffee. This was the office of Grant Reynolds. Grant has been my personal attorney for 25 years. He is a man of very few words. He helped me set up my retirement trusts. He handled my late husband's estate. And he personally oversaw the purchase of the house that Marcus was currently standing in. I walked past the receptionist, who knew me by name, and went straight into Grant's office. Grant was sitting at his heavy mahogany desk. He looked up from a stack of files, took off his reading glasses, and saw the look on my face. He did not say hello. He did not offer me a seat. He just closed the folder in front of him and folded his hands. "What happened?" "Patty?" he asked, his voice low and calm. I walked over to his desk, pulled my phone out of my pocket, and opened the photo gallery. I set the phone down right in front of him. "I need you to look at these," I said. Grant picked up the phone. He swiped to the first picture. It was the forged residential lease agreement, clearly showing Marcus's name listed under the property owner section. Grant's eyebrows slightly raised. He swiped to the next picture, And the next, he looked at every single page of Liam's handwritten ledger, complete with 24 distinct signatures from Ma, acknowledging the receipt of cash. For 2 full minutes, the only sound in the office was the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, Grant set the phone down. He looked at me, his face utterly blank, which is how you know a lawyer is furiously doing math in his head. $1,800 a month, Grant said quietly. For 24 months, that is over $43,000 in cash, untaxed, unreported, from a property he has absolutely zero legal claim to. Exactly, I said. Grant stood up. He walked over to a heavy, steel fireproof safe built into the wall behind his bookshelf. He dialed in the combination, opened the heavy door, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He brought it back to the desk and slid out a heavy, embossed document. It was the original property deed. Just to be absolutely clear, Grant said, tapping the paper with his index finger, your name is the only name on this deed. Marcus is not a co-owner. How is not a tenant? Because he has never signed a lease with you or paid you rent. Legally speaking, he is a guest. A non-paying guest who has overstayed his welcome. He told me today that it was his property. I said, my voice completely flat. He told me I was too old to understand how real estate worked. He told me he was building equity for his family. Grant let out a short, humorless breath. He looked down at the forged lease on my phone. Well, Grant said, he is certainly building something, but it is not equity. It is a federal paper trail. Patty, if he has been collecting this much cash, he has to be putting it somewhere. A guy like Marcus doesn't just stuff 40 grand under a mattress. He is using it to fund that flashy investment firm of his. He is using your house to create a fake cash flow to impress his investors. That is what I figured. I said, so, how do we dismantle it? Grant sat back down. He pulled a fresh legal pad toward him and uncapped his pen. First, Grant said, we do not say a word to him. We let him keep thinking he is in charge. Second, I am bringing in Elena. She is a forensic auditor I work with on complex fraud cases. We are going to trace exactly where that cash went. Because once we prove he is commingling untaxed, illicit rent money with his business accounts, we don't just evict him. We completely destroy his company. I looked at the original deed sitting on the desk. I thought about the heavy gold Rolex on Marcus's wrist. Call Elena. I said, let's turn the lights on. Elena arrived at Grant's office exactly 30 minutes later. When you hear the phrase forensic auditor, you might picture someone in a stiff gray suit carrying a calculator. Elena was not that. She was a woman in her late 40s, wearing a comfortable black sweater and carrying a heavy canvas tote bag that looked like it weighed 50 pounds. She did not waste time with small talk. She poured herself a cup of black coffee from the carafe in the corner, sat down at the heavy conference table, and opened her laptop. Grant handed her my phone, which was still displaying the photos I had taken of Liam's lease agreement and the handwritten cash ledger. Elena stared at the screen. She scrolled through the 24 distinct signatures Marcus had left behind. She did not say a word for a long time. In a power plant, when a catastrophic short circuit happens, the damage is rarely contained to just one wire. Electricity is lazy. It looks for the path of least resistance, and if it jumps the track, it will fry everything connected to that grid. When I looked at Elena tracing those payments, I knew we were not just looking at a bad wire. We were looking at a system-wide failure. Okay, Elena finally said, setting the phone down. Her voice was sharp and clear. $1,800 a month. Paid in physical cash. For 2 solid years. That is $43,200. Grant. Who pays the property taxes on this house? Patricia does, Grant said, leaning forward in his leather chair. I personally cut the check out of her trust account every single November. It is filed with the city and the county as a primary residential property. Non-income producing. Elena nodded slowly. A very small, very cold smile touched the corners of her mouth. Well, she said, that is our first massive point of leverage. Marcus is operating an illegal, unpermitted commercial rental unit inside a residential property he does not own. But it gets much worse for him. If he is collecting this rent in cash, I guarantee you he is not declaring it on his federal income tax returns. I sat quietly, letting the weight of her words settle into the room. Tax evasion. I said. Exactly. Grant replied. Patty, what Marcus did to you is a massive breach of trust. It is civil fraud. And we could easily sue him for the $43,000. But if he is hiding that cash from the Internal Revenue Service, that is a federal crime. That is not just a slap on the wrist. That is asset seizure. That is prison time. I thought about Marcus standing in my kitchen just an hour earlier. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated arrogance in his voice when he called me a retired old woman with too much time on her hands. I thought about the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist and the expensive slate gray BMW sitting in my driveway. He honestly believed he was a financial genius. He believed he had outsmarted the system, outsmarted his landlord, and outsmarted his aging mother-in-law. He had no idea he had just handed a perfect, neatly documented paper trail of federal tax evasion to a master electrician, a ruthless estate lawyer, and a forensic auditor. He is arrogant, I said softly, looking at Elena, but he is also desperate to look wealthy. He runs a boutique investment firm. He hosts massive networking parties for high-net-worth clients at my house. He wouldn't just take that cash and stuff it under a mattress. He is using it. Elena's eyes lit up. This was exactly what she did for a living. She hunted down the money people thought they had successfully buried. Men like Marcus never hide money in the walls, Elena said, her fingers already flying across her keyboard. They use it to inflate their own balloons. If he is trying to impress wealthy investors, he needs to show them that he has personal capital. He needs to look like he has cash flow. I am going to run a full background trace on his limited liability companies. I want to see exactly where he is depositing this cash and what he is telling his investors that money actually is. Do it, I said. Trace every single penny. I want to know exactly how deep the rot goes before we pull the plug. Grant looked at me. Patty, you need to understand that once we start this process, there is no going back. If Elena finds what we think she is going to find, and we hand this over to the authorities, Marcus's life as he knows it is entirely over. His firm will collapse. His reputation will be destroyed. Are you prepared for that? I did not hesitate. I did not blink. Grant, I said, my voice perfectly steady. I spent 40 years working around high voltage. When you find a dangerous, illegal bypass in the system, you do not politely ask the guy who installed it to take it down. You isolate the circuit. You cut the main power. And you tear the whole thing out of the wall so it can never start a fire again. He built his fake empire on my foundation. Now, I am taking my foundation back. Grant slowly closed his legal pad. He gave me a single, definitive nod. The audit had officially begun, and Marcus, sitting in his expensive suit in my living room, was completely oblivious to the storm that was gathering right above his head. It took Elena exactly 4 days to unravel my son-in-law's entire financial existence. For those 4 days, I did not hear a single word from Marcus. He did not call to apologize for the lock on the basement door. He did not call to check on the electrical issue. He just went about his life, driving his expensive car, wearing his heavy gold watch, entirely convinced that he had successfully put me in my place. He thought I was just sitting at home, tending to my hydrangeas, feeling thoroughly defeated. I was actually sitting in Grant's office, drinking black coffee, watching a forensic auditor dismantle his life on a projector screen. When Grant called me back downtown on a Friday morning, his voice on the phone was completely flat. He just said, "Patty, you need to come see this." I walked into the conference room. Elena was sitting at the head of the heavy mahogany table. She did not look excited. She looked like someone who had just stepped in something unpleasant on the sidewalk and was trying to scrape it off her shoe. She had a thick stack of printed financial records sitting in front of her. "Patricia," Elena said, skipping the small talk entirely, "your son-in-law is not just an arrogant jerk. He is a textbook fraudster, and he is incredibly sloppy." She tapped a button on her laptop, and a complex flowchart appeared on the screen on the wall. In a power plant, we have a phenomenon called phantom voltage. It happens when an electrical meter reads a high voltage on a wire, making you think there is massive power running through the system. But it is just an illusion. It is a magnetic field bleeding over from another circuit. The second you actually connect a load to that wire, the voltage instantly drops to 0. There is no real current. There is no real power. Marcus was living a life of phantom voltage. Elena pointed to a box on the screen labeled with a very pretentious name. "This is a holding company Marcus registered 2 years ago," Elena explained. "He calls it Vanguard Horizon Properties. It is a shell. It produces absolutely nothing. But every single month, exactly 3 days after your basement tenant hands him $1,800 in cash, Marcus makes a series of structured cash deposits into this holding company's bank account." I looked at the dates on the screen. They lined up perfectly with Liam's handwritten ledger. "He doesn't deposit it all at once," Elena continued. "He breaks it up. 500 here, 600 there. He is trying to avoid triggering a currency transaction report at the bank. That right there is a federal crime called structuring. But that is not even the worst part." She brought up another document. It was a glossy, beautifully designed investment prospectus. It had Marcus's face printed on the front, looking sharp and professional in his tailored navy suit. Marcus uses this brochure to recruit high-net-worth clients to his investment firm, Elena said. "He needs these wealthy people to trust him with their money. To do that, he has to look like he is already a highly successful real estate investor himself. So, he shows them the balance sheets for Vanguard Horizon Properties." I stared at the brochure. A cold, heavy realization settled in my stomach. "He is claiming my house is his," I said quietly. "Exactly," Grant said, leaning forward and folding his hands on the table. "He lists your address as the crown jewel of his personal property portfolio. He uses the illegal, untaxed cash he steals from your basement to show a consistent, positive cash flow. He tells these investors that he is a master of property management and passive income. He is using your actual, physical asset to create a fake foundation for his business." Elena clicked to the final slide. It was a loan document from a major regional bank. Because his holding company looked so profitable on paper, Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, A bank approved him for a massive business line of credit. Over $200,000. That is how he bought the slate gray BMW. That is how he pays for the expensive suits and the lavish networking dinners he borrowed against a fake portfolio, using your stolen equity as the proof of income. I sat back in my chair. I thought about Marcus standing in my hallway, telling me I did not have the mental capacity to understand modern real estate. He had built a towering house of cards, and he had built it right on top of my name. If the bank finds out he does not own the collateral he claimed, Grant said slowly, they will call the entire loan due immediately. It is called a default trigger. And if the Internal Revenue Service finds out he is running an undeclared commercial rental and structuring cash deposits to avoid taxes, Elena added, they will freeze every single asset attached to his name. His personal accounts, his business accounts. His firm will be completely and permanently defunct. They both looked at me. They were waiting for my reaction. They were waiting to see if a 69-year-old mother would actually drop the hammer on her own daughter's husband. I looked at the glossy brochure on the table. I thought about the heavy, vibrating hum of the overloaded electrical panel in my house. A bypass that dangerous could not be ignored. It had to be destroyed before it burned everything to the ground. He is hosting a massive networking party for his investors at my house this coming weekend. I said, my voice completely devoid of any hesitation. He is having caterers set up a tent on the lawn I pay for. He wants to show off his empire. Grant slowly nodded. He knew exactly where I was going with this. Let him set up the tent. I said, let him pour the champagne. We are going to cut the power with everyone watching. I want to tell you about that Sunday dinner. Because if you want to understand the sheer depth of a person's delusion, you have to watch them. Celebrate a victory they have not actually won. 2 days had passed since I sat in Grant's office and watched Elena map out the federal crimes my son-in-law was committing. 2 days of absolute silence from me. Chloe had returned from her business trip in Chicago on Saturday night. Sunday morning, she called and invited me over for a family dinner. She sounded exhausted. But she said Marcus was cooking, and he insisted I come over. I knew exactly why he wanted me there. He did not want my company. He wanted to test the waters. He wanted to look me in the eye and make sure I was properly broken. I drove my 10-year-old pickup truck back to my house and parked it on the gravel, right next to his immaculate slate gray BMW. The car he bought with a fraudulent line of credit secured by my property. When I walked through the front door, the house smelled like roasted garlic and expensive meat. Chloe gave me a tight hug in the hallway. She looked drained. The way someone looks when they are working 60 hours a week to keep their head above water. Marcus was standing in the kitchen. He was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my first car. He was standing over the marble island I paid to have installed, using a silver grating tool to shave fresh, imported black truffles over 2 thick perfectly seared prime steaks. He looked up when I walked in. He did not look nervous. He looked incredibly, remarkably smug. Patricia, he said, his voice smooth and loud. Glad you could make it. Have a seat. I walked over and sat down on one of the leather bar stools. Marcus plated the 2 truffle-covered steaks and set them down, one for him and one for Chloe. Then he reached into the pantry. He pulled out a yellow plastic tray of cheap, store-bought vanilla wafers, the kind that cost maybe $3 at the corner pharmacy. He slid the plastic tray across the expensive marble counter until it stopped right in front of me. He did not offer me a steak. He did not even offer me a proper plate. I picked these up for you this morning. Patricia, he said, offering a smile that did not reach his eyes. I know heavy food upsets your stomach at your age. And these are nice and soft, easy to chew. Chloe looked down at her plate. a little embarrassed. But she did not say anything. She just let him do it. I looked at the cheap plastic wrapper. Then I looked at the shaved truffles resting on his imported porcelain plate. I looked at the heavy gold Rolex gleaming on his wrist as he poured himself a glass of dark, heavy Cabernet wine. I did not say a word. I did not throw the cookies back at him. I just reached out, opened the plastic, and took one of the dry vanilla wafers. I took a small bite. Marcus watched me eat it. And right there, in the quiet of the kitchen, I saw his shoulders physically drop. I saw a profound, undeniable wave of relief wash over his face. He genuinely believed he had won. He mistook my silence for absolute surrender. He thought the incident by the basement door on Tuesday had been my final attempt at asserting authority, and because I had walked away, he thought I was finished. He believed I was just a tired, confused 69-year-old woman who had finally accepted her place at the bottom of his hierarchy. He leaned against the counter, swirling his expensive wine, looking at me like I was a defeated dog sitting on his porch. I was just telling Chloe about the big event this coming Saturday, Marcus said, taking a sip of his wine. He was practically vibrating with arrogance. My firm is hosting our annual investor mixer right here in the backyard. We have caterers coming. A full champagne bar. I have 50 of the highest net worth individuals in the city coming to view my property. It is going to be the final push we need to close our new fund. He emphasized the words, my property, while looking dead into my eyes. He was daring me to correct him in front of Chloe. That sounds like a very big day. Marcus, I said quietly. My voice was perfectly flat, completely devoid of any anger. It is. He smiled, cutting into his steak. It is all about showing stability. Patricia, investors need to see that you have a solid foundation. You have to project success if you want people to hand you their money. I sat there, eating my $3 cookie. In a power plant, when a high-pressure steam valve is completely blocked, the machine does not shake. It does not rattle. It goes completely, terrifyingly silent. The pressure gauge needles peg themselves all the way to the right and stay there. To an amateur, the silence sounds like everything is running smoothly. To an engineer, the silence means the steel is about to tear itself apart. Marcus was listening to the silence. He thought he was a genius. He thought he was eating a victory dinner. He had absolutely no idea that my lawyer was currently drafting an eviction notice. He had no idea that a forensic auditor had already handed his bank records over to the Internal Revenue Service. Every bite of truffle he swallowed, every sip of wine he drank, was bought with structured cash and federal tax evasion. Well, I said softly, brushing a cookie crumb off my jeans. I hope Saturday is everything you deserve. Marcus. Oh, it will be. He smirked. I finished my water, kissed Chloe on the cheek, and walked out the front door. The storm was fully charged. Now, I just had to wait for the party to start. I did not sleep much that Sunday night. When you are a mother, you possess a very specific, very stubborn kind of blindness. You want to believe the absolute best about your children. You want to believe that if they are standing in the middle of a burning building, it is only because someone else dragged them inside and locked the door. You never want to admit that they might be the one holding the match. Before I pulled the final lever on Marcus's life, I needed to know exactly where my daughter stood. I needed to know if Chloe was a hostage in his delusion, or if she was a willing participant. On Monday morning, I called her. I asked her to meet me for a quick cup of coffee at a small cafe right down the street from her corporate office. I needed to speak to her alone, completely away from the heavy, suffocating gravity of her husband's ego. She arrived 15 minutes late. She was wearing a sharp, professional trench coat, carrying a massive leather tote bag, and gripping a $6 iced latte like it was a life preserver. She looked incredibly tired. The kind of bone-deep fatigue that comes from holding up someone else's fake reality. She sat down across from me in the small booth. She did not even take off her coat. "I only have 20 minutes. Mom," she said, checking her smartwatch. "Marcus has me running errands for the big investor mixer on Saturday during my lunch break. What is going on?" I looked at my daughter. My beautiful, hardworking, exhausted daughter. "Clue," I said, keeping my voice incredibly soft. "I need to ask you about the house. Did you know that Marcus renovated the basement? Did you know he moved a medical student down there and is charging him $1,800 a month in cash?" Chloe did not look shocked. She did not gasp. She did not cover her mouth in horror. Instead, she let out a long, tubal, irritated sigh. She rolled her eyes, leaned back in the booth, and looked at me like I was a toddler who had just asked a spectacularly stupid question. "Mom? Please," Chloe said, rubbing her temples. "Marcus told me you threw a massive fit about the door lock last week. He told me you brought an electrician over just to snoop around." "I brought an electrician over because the main breaker was overheating," I corrected her quietly. "But that is not the point. Chloe, he is running a secret commercial rental unit inside my house. Without my permission, without a legal permit." Chloe crossed her arms. Her face hardened. It was not her face anymore. It was Marcus's face. She was wearing his arrogance like a hand-me-down sweater. "It is not a secret." "Mom?" she snapped, her voice dripping with that exact same condescension her husband loved to use. "It is a strategy. Marcus is an investment manager. He understands how to maximize assets. You let us live in that house, which means we are managing it. He created a passive income stream to help fund his firm so he can build our future." I sat completely still. "He forged my name on a lease." "Chloe," I said, "he is taking cash and not reporting it. That is not a strategy. That is a crime. Stop being so dramatic," she hissed, leaning forward. "You are acting like he robbed a bank. He is just hustling. He is under a massive amount of pressure to close this new fund by Saturday. He has high net worth clients breathing down his neck. He is trying to be the man of the house. And you are constantly undermining him just because your name happens to be on a piece of paper in some lawyer's office." There it was. Just because your name happens to be on a piece of paper. She actually believed it. Marcus had gaslit her so thoroughly, so completely, that she genuinely thought my generosity was just a technicality. She believed that because they lived there, they owned it. She had completely bought into his fake empire. And she was willing to defend him against the very woman who was keeping a roof over her head. In a power plant, there is a golden rule about rescue operations. If you see a junior operator grab a live, high-voltage wire, do you never reach out and grab them with your bare hands to pull them away? If you do, the current will instantly travel through their body and into yours. And it will kill you both. You have to step back. You have to let them take the shock, and you run to the control room to cut the power to the entire grid. I could not save Chloe by arguing with her. She was holding on to the live wire. She had chosen her side. I looked at her for a long, quiet moment. I did not yell. I did not cry. The maternal blindness I had walked in with was completely gone, replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. "Okay, sweetheart," I said softly. I reached into my purse and left a $5 bill on the table for her coffee. I understand. Chloe relaxed immediately. Just like Marcus? She mistook my quiet retreat for a victory. She thought she had successfully put her nagging, outdated mother in her place. Thank you, Mom, she said, checking her watch again and standing up. I really need to get back to the office. Just try to be supportive this Saturday. Okay? This party is a huge deal for us. I wouldn't miss it for the world, I said. I watched her walk out of the cafe and disappear down the busy sidewalk. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed Grant's private office number. He answered on the first ring. Grant. I said, Patty. He replied, Did you talk to her? I did, I said. My voice is hard and cold as concrete. She is entirely compromised. She thinks he is a genius. She thinks my deed is just a piece of paper. Grant let out a heavy breath on the other end of the line. I am sorry. Patty, I know that is not what you wanted to hear. It is what I needed to hear. I said, Are the documents ready? Elena finished the final forensic audit this morning. Grant said, The anonymous package has been sent to the Internal Revenue Service via courier. The eviction notice is drafted, signed, and legally sealed. We have everything. Good, I said. Print the copies. Put on a nice suit. Grant, you and I are going to a networking party this Saturday. The hardest part of any controlled demolition is the waiting. Between my coffee with Chloe on Monday morning and the massive networking party scheduled for Saturday afternoon, I had 4 full days to sit with my decision. 4 days of absolute, uninterrupted silence from my daughter and my son-in-law. In a power plant, you never just walk up to a massive, overloaded circuit and rip the main breaker out of the wall. If you do that, the energy has nowhere to go. It creates a flash of raw plasma that can blind you, burn you, and destroy the entire panel. You have to shut down the system systematically. You isolate the outer circuits first. You route the power away from the critical infrastructure, and then, when the machine is completely boxed in, you cut the main line. That is exactly what Grant, Elena, and I were doing all week. We were boxing Marcus in. On Thursday afternoon, I drove back downtown to Grant's office. It was raining a cold, steady drizzle that made the city look gray and sharp. I walked into the conference room, and Elena was already there, drinking her usual black coffee. She did not have her laptop open this time. She just had a single, thick manila envelope sitting in the middle of the mahogany table. It was sealed with heavy packing tape. The courier picked up the duplicate of this package an hour ago, Elena said, tapping the envelope with her fingernail. It is on its way to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. It is not just an anonymous tip. Patricia, it is a fully documented, mathematically proven forensic report. It includes his forged lease, the 24 months of cash ledger signatures, his structured bank deposits, and the fraudulent loan application. I looked at the heavy envelope. How long until they act on it? I asked. The IRS moves slowly, Elena admitted, leaning back in her chair. But when they receive a file this perfectly packaged, they don't ignore it. By next week, his business and personal accounts will be flagged. By next month, they will freeze his assets pending a full audit. He will not be able to move a single dollar without a federal agent watching. I nodded slowly. The outer circuits were officially isolated. Now, it was time for the main breaker. Grant walked into the room carrying a sleek, black leather folder. He sat down next to Elena and opened it. Inside was a stack of heavy, cream-colored legal paper, stamped with a raised notary seal. "This," Grant said, sliding the document toward me, "is a formal notice to quit. It is the legal precursor to a full eviction. I have drafted it specifically citing his unauthorized commercial use of the property and his illegal subletting, because he has absolutely zero legal claim to the house, and because he is actively committing fraud on the premises. He does not get the standard friendly warning. He gets this." I read the bold, black letters at the top of the page. It looked heavy. It looked final. "So, we just mail this to him?" I asked. Grant smiled. It was a very small, very cold smile. The kind of smile a lawyer gets when he knows he holds a royal flush. "No, Patty," Grant said softly. "If we mail this to him, or if we serve him privately, Marcus will do exactly what he has always done. He will spin a story. He will lie to Chloe. He will hire a cheap lawyer to stall the process. And he will keep using your house to impress his clients while the case drags through the courts. We cannot give him the cover of darkness." Grant leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "You told me he is hosting a massive networking event for his investors this Saturday." Grant continued. 50 high-net-worth individuals, the people he desperately needs to impress to keep his fake empire afloat. If we want to dismantle his delusion permanently, we have to do it in the light. We have to serve him right in front of the audience he is trying to perform for." I looked at the legal document. I thought about Marcus standing in my kitchen, feeding me a $3 vanilla wafer while he ate imported truffles. I thought about Chloe looking at me across a cafe table, telling me that I was just a name on a piece of paper. "Are you going to serve him yourself?" "Grant?" I asked. "I am his landlord's legal counsel," Grant said, straightening his tie. "I would not miss the opportunity for the world. I will be wearing my best suit." We spent the next hour going over the exact timing. We were not going to show up early. We were going to wait until the party was in full swing. We were going to let Marcus pour the champagne. We were going to let him stand up in front of his wealthy guests and tell his lies about the equity he was building. We were going to let him reach the absolute peak of his own arrogance. And then, we were going to turn the lights out. Friday night. I sat alone in my small apartment. I ironed a simple, clean blouse and a pair of dark slacks. I did not feel guilty. I did not feel sad. I just felt a deep, quiet resolve. The house was wired with lies, and the breaker was finally about to trip. Saturday morning arrived with a clear, crisp blue sky. It was the kind of perfect, golden weather you simply cannot buy. Though I am certain Marcus would have tried to put it on his fraudulent credit line if he could. I drove my pickup truck to the house around noon, long before the guests were scheduled to arrive. I intentionally parked down the street, leaving the driveway completely clear for the parade of luxury cars that would soon be pulling up. I walked up the concrete sidewalk, the one I had paid a contractor to pour 5 years ago. The transformation of my backyard was staggering. Marcus had spared absolutely no expense. There was a massive, pristine white canvas tent set up on the green lawn. Underneath it, waitstaff in crisp black uniforms were polishing crystal champagne flutes and arranging delicate, expensive hors d'oeuvres on silver platters. A string quartet was setting up their instruments near the garden patio, tuning their violins in the cool autumn air. It looked exactly like a spread from a high-end luxury lifestyle magazine. It was a beautiful monument to absolute fiction, entirely funded by stolen cash and federal tax evasion. I walked through the side door into the kitchen. The air inside was frantic. Chloe was running around with a clipboard, checking off lists, looking completely overwhelmed. When she saw me, she just gave a quick, stressed wave and disappeared upstairs to change into her dress. Then, Marcus walked in. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit. The fabric had a subtle, rich sheen to it that screamed money. His hair was perfectly styled, and his heavy gold Rolex caught the bright light from the kitchen windows. He was buzzing with that specific kind of nervous, arrogant energy of a man who is about to ask people to hand him millions of dollars. He stopped dead when he saw me standing by the kitchen island. I was wearing a simple axed, clean blouse and my everyday dark slacks. His polished smile dropped immediately. He looked me up and down, and I could see the exact moment the deep annoyance flared behind his eyes. To him, I was not his landlord. I was not his mother-in-law. I was a glaring, blue-collar stain on the perfect aesthetic he was desperately trying to project. He walked over to me, keeping his voice low so the hired caterers would not hear. "Patricia," he said, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "I didn't think you would get here this early. I wanted to see how everything was coming along," I said quietly, resting my hands on the cool marble counter. He let out a long, put-upon breath. He leaned in slightly, trying to use his physical height to establish dominance in a room I had paid for in cash. "Listen to me," Marcus said, his voice dripping with that familiar, polished condescension. "This afternoon is absolutely critical for my firm. I have 50 of the highest net worth individuals in the state walking through those doors in less than an hour. They are coming to see my property. They are coming to see my stability." He paused, looking pointedly at my simple blouse, his expression hardening into pure elitism. "Do me a favor today, Patricia," he continued, pointing a finger toward the pantry. "Stay in the kitchen, or stick to the back hallway. These are serious investors. They do not need to hear your outdated stories about working at the power plant. They don't need to be reminded of your background. Try not to embarrass me today. Just stay out of sight." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not tell him that if I made one phone call to the local police department right now, he would be escorted off my manicured lawn in handcuffs for operating an illegal commercial business in a power plant. The final 10 seconds before a massive turbine is brought online are the most dangerous. You never interrupt the startup sequence. You let the machine spin up to its absolute maximum velocity, because that is the only way you can test if the emergency shutdown system actually works. You have to let the pressure peak. I looked at his smug, perfectly groomed face. "Okay, Marcus," I said softly, "I will stay in the kitchen. I will not say a word to your guests." The sheer, unfiltered relief that washed over his face was incredible. His shoulders instantly relaxed. His chest puffed out a little more. He actually reached out and patted my shoulder, a deeply patronizing gesture, as if I were a slow, confused employee who had finally understood a simple instruction. "Good," he smiled, turning away. "Grab a water or something. Just keep a low profile." He walked out of the kitchen, stepping out onto the mahogany deck to survey his kingdom. He genuinely believed he had won. He thought he had successfully hidden the old, uncultured woman in the back room so he could play the wealthy real estate magnate out front. He mistook my quiet retreat for absolute submission. He had no idea that I was not hiding. I was just taking my position behind the blast wall. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, stood by the kitchen window, and watched as the first sleek, black luxury cars began to pull up to the curb. Men in tailored suits and women in designer dresses began walking up my driveway, holding expensive gifts, laughing, ready to hand their money to a ghost. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from Grant. It simply read, "I am pulling into the neighborhood now." The grid was fully loaded. It was time to pull the switch. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my backyard did not look like a backyard anymore. It looked like a luxury country club. I stood by the kitchen window, partially hidden behind the curtains, watching the scene unfold, exactly as Marcus had designed it. There were 50 people mingling on the lawn I had paid for. Men in sharp, tailored suits. Women in designer dresses holding tiny, expensive leather clutches. The waitstaff moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with smoked salmon and crystal flutes of imported champagne. The string quartet was playing a soft, elegant classical piece that drifted through the cool autumn air. Marcus was in his element. He was gliding from group to group, shaking hands, laughing loudly, exuding the absolute confidence of a man who believes he has conquered the world. He was pointing out the landscaping. He was pointing to the mahogany deck. He was performing. Chloe was standing near the edge of the patio. She looked beautiful in a dark blue dress, but she also looked incredibly tense. She was smiling, nodding at the wealthy wives of the investors. Playing the part of the successful executive's partner, she had completely surrendered to his illusion. At exactly 2:30, the string quartet suddenly stopped playing. Marcus walked to the center of the white canvas tent. He reached out and gently tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The clear, sharp ringing sound cut through the low hum of conversation. 50 wealthy investors turned their attention toward my son-in-law. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice loud, smooth, and heavily practiced. "Thank you all so much for being here today. I want to officially welcome you to my home, and I want to welcome you to the future of Vanguard Horizon Properties." A polite murmur of applause rippled through the crowd. I stood in the quiet kitchen, holding my cold cup of coffee, listening to every single word. "When I started my firm," Marcus continued, pacing slowly under the tent like a motivational speaker, "I knew that in order to ask for your trust, I needed to prove my own methodology. You do not hand your capital to a man who does not know how to build a foundation. You hand it to a man who understands how to identify undervalued assets, acquire them, and maximize their hidden potential." He stopped pacing. He turned and gestured dramatically toward the house. "Toward my house. This property," Marcus said, his voice swelling with deep, manufactured pride, "was my very first major acquisition. When Chloe and I took this over 5 years ago, it was just a standard suburban lot. But I did not look at it as a place to live. I looked at it as a revenue vehicle." He actually paused for effect. He was soaking in their undivided attention. "I took our own capital," he lied smoothly, "and I personally funded a complete, high-end commercial renovation of the basement level. I bypassed the standard residential limitations and created a premium, fully permitted studio unit. That single decision created a steady, high-yield stream of passive income that has funded the expansion of Vanguard Horizon Properties for the last 24 months. That is the kind of aggressive, forward-thinking asset management I am bringing to our new fund." He raised his glass. "To smart investments," Marcus smiled, "and to building empires from the ground up." The crowd raised their glasses. "To smart investments," they echoed. They took a sip of their champagne. They were completely sold. They were looking at him with genuine respect. "In a power plant, you never test a critical safety valve when the machine is idling. It does not prove anything. If you want to know if the system can handle a catastrophic failure, you have to bring the turbine up to absolute maximum capacity. You have to let the pressure gauge peg itself all the way into the red zone. You have to let the machine spin so fast that it is vibrating against the concrete floor. Only then do you pull the emergency kill switch. Marcus was at maximum velocity. He was standing in front of 50 millionaires. Claiming my property. Claiming my money. Claiming a completely fraudulent business model as his own absolute genius. He was at the absolute peak of his false triumph. I set my coffee cup down on the marble counter. I looked past the canvas tent, past the wealthy guests, and focused on the long gravel driveway leading up from the street. A man was walking up the driveway. He was not walking quickly. He was not rushing. He was walking with the slow, measured, heavy stride of a man who knows exactly how much damage he is about to cause. It was Grant. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored charcoal suit. In his right hand, he carried a thick, black leather legal folder. The embossed gold seal on the front of the folder caught the afternoon sunlight. He did not look like a party guest. He looked like an executioner. He walked past Marcus's slate gray BMW. He walked up the concrete sidewalk. He bypassed the front door entirely and walked straight toward the wooden gate that led to the backyard. The storm had officially arrived. I did not stay in the kitchen. I pushed the screen door open and stepped out onto the mahogany deck. I did not say a word. I just stood at the top of the stairs, clasping my hands in front of me, and watched Grant open the wooden gate. I stood at the top of the mahogany stairs. Grant opened the wooden gate. The heavy iron latch made a sharp, metallic click that was completely lost under the sound of 50 wealthy people clapping for my son-in-law. Grant did not hesitate. He walked directly onto the manicured lawn. A waiter in a crisp black uniform stepped into his path, trying to offer him a silver tray of imported champagne. Grant did not even look at the man. He did not break his stride. He just kept walking, moving like a dark cloud, cutting straight through a clear blue sky. Marcus was still standing near the center of the white canvas tent. He was holding his crystal flute, soaking in the admiration of the crowd, wearing that perfect, practiced smile. Then he saw Grant approaching. Because Marcus is a man entirely obsessed with appearances, and because his entire worldview is dictated by the perceived wealth of the people around him, he immediately assumed Grant was someone important. Grant was wearing a custom-tailored suit that easily cost 3 times what Marcus's did. He carried himself with absolute, unassailable authority. Marcus thought this was a high-net-worth walk-in, a massive potential client who had heard about the mixer and decided to drop by. Marcus quickly handed his empty champagne flute to Chloe. He stepped forward, smoothing the front of his jacket, and extended his hand. "Welcome," Marcus said, projecting his voice so the nearby investors could hear his perfect hospitality. "I don't believe we have been formally introduced. I am Marcus, the founder of Vanguard Horizon." Grant stopped. He did not take Marcus's hand. He just looked at it for a brief, agonizing second. And then he looked Marcus dead in the eyes. The atmosphere around them shifted instantly. The people standing closest to them stopped talking. The silence started to ripple outward, moving through the crowd like a cold breeze. "No, we have not been introduced," Grant said. His voice was not a shout. It was not angry. It possessed a heavy, carrying baritone that cut perfectly through the ambient noise of the party. "My name is Grant Reynolds. I am the senior partner at Reynolds & Vance Law Firm, and I am the personal legal counsel for Patricia Coyle, the sole and exclusive owner of this property." Marcus's extended hand slowly dropped to his side. The perfect, polished smile on his face twitched. He blinked rapidly, clearly trying to process the words that had just been spoken. "I am sorry," Marcus said, letting out a short, forced laugh. He looked around at the nearest investors, trying to play it off as a strange joke. "I think you have the wrong address. Mr. Reynolds, this is my home." "No, Marcus," Grant said, his voice dropping to a temperature that felt like freezing rain. "It is not." Grant opened the heavy black leather folder. He pulled out the cream-colored legal document with the raised gold notary seal. He did not hand it to Marcus gently. He pressed it flat against Marcus's chest, forcing my son-in-law to grab it or let it fall to the grass. "You are being formally served with a notice to quit," Grant stated, speaking with absolute, surgical precision. "You are a non-paying guest on my client's property because you have engaged in the illegal, unpermitted commercial subletting of the basement level, and because you have fraudulently represented this residential home as a corporate asset of Vanguard Horizon Properties. Your right to remain on these premises is immediately terminated." The silence under the tent was no longer just a ripple. It was an absolute vacuum. 50 wealthy investors, the very people Marcus had just spent 30 minutes lying to, the people he had just asked for millions of dollars, were staring at him. Nobody took a sip of their drinks. Nobody moved. You could hear the faint rustle of the canvas tent blowing in the wind. "You have exactly 72 hours to vacate the property, completely and permanently," Grant continued, entirely ignoring a collective gasp from a group of women standing just 2 feet away. "If you are found on these premises after Tuesday morning, the local police will be called, and you will be removed for criminal trespassing." Marcus did not move. He did not speak. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. His skin turned a pale, sickly shade of gray. The heavy gold Rolex on his wrist suddenly looked incredibly cheap, like a plastic toy on the arm of a terrified little boy who had just been caught stealing from a cash register. Behind him, Chloe dropped the crystal champagne flute. It hit the grass with a dull thud, not shattering, just spilling expensive wine over her expensive shoes. She stared at Grant with wide, horrified eyes. She finally realized that the piece of paper she had dismissed at the cafe was currently destroying her entire life. Marcus looked down at the legal document in his hand. He read the bold black letters at the top, "Notice to quit." Then, very slowly, his eyes drifted past Grant. He looked across the manicured lawn, past the frozen waitstaff, past the silent string quartet, and he looked up at the mahogany deck. He saw me. I was standing there, resting my hands lightly on the wooden railing. I did not smile. I did not wave. I did not show an ounce of pity. I just looked down at him. In a power plant, when a massive short circuit happens, the lights do not flicker. They do not fade gently into the evening. 1 second, the room is blindingly bright, buzzing with artificial energy. And the very next second, the main breaker trips with a sound like a gunshot. And everything goes entirely, completely black. Marcus's fake empire had just lost power, and the emergency lights were not coming on. For about 10 seconds, nobody under that white canvas tent breathed. In a power plant, when a main transformer blows, the real danger is not the initial explosion. The real danger is the cascade. It is the moment the other connected systems realize the primary power source is gone, and they all simultaneously scramble to protect themselves. You watch the digital monitors turn from green to yellow to flashing red in a matter of milliseconds. I stood on the mahogany deck and watched the cascade hit my son-in-law's face. Marcus was a man who survived entirely on momentum and perception. Without those two things, he was just a man in a very expensive suit standing on someone else's grass. He looked down at the notice to quit in his hand. He looked at the raised gold seal. Then, his survival instincts kicked in. The backup generators tried to fire up. He let out a loud, incredibly forced laugh. He turned away from Grant and faced the crowd of 50 silent investors. "I apologize. Everyone," Marcus said, his voice pitching up half an octave, losing its smooth, practiced resonance. "This is just a massive misunderstanding. That woman up there is my mother-in-law. She is pushing 70 years old. Her mind is not what it used to be. She gets very confused about the family trust and the property deeds. We are actually in the middle of sorting out her medical care. Please, enjoy the champagne. I will have my security handle this." He actually tried to do it again. Even while holding his own eviction notice, he tried to use my age as a weapon. He tried to paint me as a senile, live, confused elderly woman who had wandered out of her bedroom to ruin his very important business meeting. He turned back to Grant, his face twisting into an ugly, desperate sneer. He lowered his voice. "But not enough. Get off my property." Marcus hissed at Grant. "Before I ruin your entire career?" I did not wait for Grant to respond. I placed my hand on the wooden handrail and slowly walked down the mahogany stairs. I did not rush. I walked with the heavy, deliberate steps of a woman who had spent 40 years walking across concrete factory floors. The crowd of wealthy men and women naturally parted for me. They stepped back, clearing a path directly to the center of the tent. I walked right up to Marcus and stood next to my lawyer. "I am not confused." "Marcus," I said. My voice was very quiet, but in that silent tent, it carried perfectly. "And there is no family trust." Marcus stared at me. A bead of sweat broke out on his forehead, right at his perfect hairline. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin another lie. But Grant cut him off completely. Grant reached into his heavy leather folder. He pulled out a thick stack of municipal documents. "My client is completely lucid," Grant said, projecting his baritone voice so every single investor could hear the absolute truth. "And she is the sole legal owner of this estate. She purchased it 5 years ago in cash. She has personally paid the $8,000 property tax bill every single November. Your name is not on the deed. It has never been on the deed. You are a guest who has been living here entirely rent-free." A tall, silver-haired man, standing in the front row, a man Marcus had been aggressively courting all afternoon, stepped forward. He looked at Marcus, then looked at Grant. "Is this true?" the investor asked, his voice cold and flat. "You told us this property was the primary asset of Vanguard Horizon." Marcus swallowed hard. His throat bobbed. The heavy crystal champagne flute in his left hand began to tremble. It was a tiny movement at first, but it quickly grew until the ice-cold liquid was visibly shaking inside the glass. "It is complicated," Marcus stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the crowd. "We have an arrangement. It is essentially my property through equity management." "There is no arrangement," Grant said sharply. He pulled out the next piece of paper. It was the color photograph I had taken of the forged residential lease. "You have no equity. What you do have is a massive legal liability, because without my client's permission, you illegally renovated her basement into a commercial studio." Grant pulled out the photographs of the handwritten ledger, 24 distinct signatures. "And you moved a tenant into that basement," Grant continued, his voice completely devoid of any mercy. "You collected $1,800 in cash every single month for 2 solid years. You forged my client's name to do it. You used her home, her electricity, and her foundation to run an off-the-books business. And then you lied to every single person standing in this tent, claiming that stolen cash flow was proof of your financial genius. The silence was gone. The murmurs erupted. 50 high-net-worth individuals are not stupid people. You do not get rich by ignoring giant red flags. They heard the words forged lease. They heard the words stolen cash. They looked at the terrified, sweating man standing in front of them. And the illusion completely shattered. They realized they were not looking at a rising star in the real estate market. They were looking at a con man who was about to be homeless. Marcus looked down at his shaking hand. The crystal flute clinked loudly against the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist. It sounded exactly like a cheap toy. He looked over at Chloe. My daughter was standing near the edge of the patio, her hands covering her mouth. Her face was chalk white. She was staring at the forged lease in Grant's hand. She finally understood that her husband had not just lied to me. He had lied to her. He had lied to the bank. He had lied to the federal government. Patricia. Please, Marcus whispered. It was the very first time in 5 years he had ever sounded small. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. Don't do this right now. Not in front of them. We can talk about this inside. I looked at his expensive suit. I looked at the imported truffles waiting on the silver platters. We are done talking. Marcus, I said softly, the power is out. It is time to pack your things. Marcus stood in the center of the white canvas tent, surrounded by 50 silent millionaires, whispering for me to save him. In a power plant control room, when a primary warning alarm goes off, an arrogant operator will sometimes try to blame the machine. They will say the sensor is faulty. They will say it is just a glitch in the system, a false positive. They will do anything to avoid admitting they made a mistake. But when the secondary, completely independent backup alarm goes off at the exact same time, the argument is entirely over. You are in a meltdown. And you cannot lie your way out of a meltdown. Marcus tried to lie his way out. When I refused to take the conversation inside, when I told him it was time to pack his things, his survival instinct kicked into overdrive. He turned his back on me. He turned his back on Grant. He faced the crowd of investors, and he doubled down on his absolute delusion. Ladies and gentlemen, please, Marcus said, raising his hands, trying to force a reassuring smile onto his pale, sweating face. This is completely insane. I apologize for the disruption. This man is not a real estate lawyer. This is a disgruntled neighbor. My mother-in-law is suffering from severe dementia, and she put him up to this because she is upset over a minor family dispute. He looked at the tall, silver-haired investor standing in the front row. He reached out, trying to touch the man's arm. But the investor took a very deliberate step backward. There is no tenant, Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking slightly. I swear to you, there is no one living in that basement. It is an empty storage space. This is just a massive, unfortunate misunderstanding. Now, if you will just excuse me while I have security escort them out, we can get back to. He never finished his sentence, because right at that exact moment, the wooden gate at the side of the house opened again. I had told Liam, the young medical student living in my basement, that I was having some electrical work done on the upper floors. I told him that if his temporary power cord stopped working, he should come upstairs and find me in the backyard at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Liam walked onto the manicured lawn. He was not wearing a tailored charcoal suit. He was wearing loose, faded green hospital scrubs and a pair of beat-up running shoes. He was holding a thick medical textbook in one hand and a standard white paper envelope in the other and a Speedy. He stopped at the edge of the tent. He looked at the 50 wealthy people in their designer clothes. He looked at the waitstaff holding silver trays of truffles. He looked completely and utterly confused. The crowd parted for him instinctively. He walked right into the center of the silence, stopping just a few feet away from Marcus. "Marcus?" Liam asked, his voice echoing in the quiet tent. "I am so sorry to interrupt your party, but the temporary power cord to my refrigerator just tripped again. And since I am here, I brought the $1,800 in cash for next month's rent. Do you want me to just leave the envelope on the kitchen counter like usual?" If Grant's legal documents had pulled the fire alarm, Liam's words just brought the entire building down. The silence under the tent became so heavy, it actually felt difficult to breathe. You could hear the faint rustle of the canvas in the autumn wind. You could hear the ice melting in the crystal champagne flutes. The tall, silver-haired investor looked at Liam. He looked at the green scrubs. He looked at the white envelope in the young man's hand. "Son," the older investor said, his voice quiet but carrying immense authority. "Do you rent the basement of this house from that man?" Liam looked at the investor, entirely unaware of the massive corporate execution he had just walked into. "Yes, sir," Liam answered politely, nodding his head. "I have lived down there for 2 years. It is a great little studio. Marcus is my landlord." The older investor slowly turned his head and looked at Marcus. "I have seen men get fired. I have seen men lose their tempers. But I have never, in my almost 70 years on this earth, seen a man looked at with such absolute, unfiltered disgust." The investor did not yell. He did not curse. He just looked at my son-in-law like he was a piece of garbage that had blown onto his shoe. "You are a fraud," the investor said softly. He did not wait for an explanation. He did not ask any more questions. The investor simply reached out, set his full, untouched crystal flute of imported champagne down on a nearby silver tray, and turned around. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket, walked out from under the white tent, and headed straight down the driveway toward his luxury car. He did not say goodbye. He just left. And just like that, the dam completely broke. Marcus reached out, his hand shaking violently. "Wait, Richard. Please, let me explain the cash flow. It is a strategic allocation." The older investor did not even turn his head. He just kept walking. Under the tent, the rest of the wealthy guests began setting their glasses down. It sounded like a quiet, rhythmic hailstorm. Clink, 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 crystal hitting silver. Dozens of high-net-worth individuals, the very people Marcus needed to fund his fake empire, were completely abandoning the sinking ship. Marcus stood there in his custom-tailored suit, holding an eviction notice, watching millions of dollars walk out of my backyard. He was totally paralyzed. I looked over at Chloe. My daughter was no longer standing at the edge of the patio. She had sunk down onto one of the wooden deck chairs, burying her face in her hands. The illusion was gone. She finally saw her husband exactly as he was told. The party was over. The exodus had begun. In a power plant. When a massive turbine finally trips and spins down to zero, it does not happen in absolute silence. There is a very specific, whining sound of heavy machinery losing its momentum, followed by a vast, hollow quiet that feels heavier than the noise ever did. That was the exact sound of my backyard. I stood on the mahogany deck and watched the mass exodus of 50 millionaires. It was not a panicked stampede. It was worse. It was a cold, deliberate, deeply embarrassed retreat. Nobody wanted to be seen standing next to the man who had just been exposed as a complete fraud. They set their crystal champagne flutes down on the nearest flat surfaces, the hired waitstaff, sensing the absolute death of the event, stopped passing the silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. They just backed away toward the catering van. Even the string quartet quietly placed their instruments into their velvet-lined cases. Marcus panicked. The smooth, practiced persona of the wealthy investment manager completely evaporated. He ran out from under the white canvas tent. He literally ran. He chased after the tall, silver-haired investor, Richard, who was already halfway down the concrete sidewalk heading toward the street. "Richard, wait! Please!" Marcus yelled, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Let me explain. It is a strategic allocation. I have the financials to prove it." Richard did not even break his stride. He reached his sleek black Mercedes parked on the street. His driver opened the rear door. Richard got in. The heavy car door slammed shut with a solid, expensive thud, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb. Marcus stood at the end of my driveway. Breathing heavily, he spun around, trying to catch the eyes of the other wealthy guests walking past him. "Look, we can restructure the fund," Marcus pleaded, holding his hands out. "This is just a temporary legal dispute. The equity is still there." Nobody looked at him. Men and women in tailored suits and designer dresses walked around him like he was an open manhole on the sidewalk. They clicked their key fobs. Engines started all down the street. Within 3 minutes, a parade of luxury vehicles was driving away, taking hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential investments with them. Marcus watched them leave. He stood on the gravel, his shoulders completely slumped. The custom-tailored charcoal suit suddenly looked incredibly awkward on him, like a teenager wearing his father's clothes to a school dance. His polished leather shoes were covered in a fine layer of gray dust from running down the driveway. He slowly walked back up the sidewalk. He walked past his own slate-gray BMW, the car bought with a fraudulent line of credit that was about to be called in by the bank. He stepped back under the white canvas tent. The tent was entirely empty now, except for Grant, Liam, Clue, and me. The silence was deafening. There were dozens of half-empty crystal flutes resting on the tables, the ice melting into the expensive champagne. The shaved imported truffles sat untouched on silver platters. Liam was still standing near the edge of the patio, holding his white envelope of cash. The young medical student looked between Grant, Marcus, and me, clearly realizing he had just walked into the middle of a family execution. "I am just going to," Liam whispered, pointing nervously toward the side gate. He set the envelope of cash down on a small wooden table, turned around, and practically sprinted out of the yard. Then, Chloe stood up. My daughter walked down the stairs from the patio. She did not look at her husband. She walked straight over to Grant. "Let me see it," Chloe said, her voice shaking. Grant did not say a word. He handed her the heavy black leather folder. He pulled out the color photograph of the residential lease agreement and handed it to her. Chloe stared at the paper. She looked at the signature line. She knew my handwriting, and she knew Marcus's handwriting. She saw, with absolute clarity, that her husband had forged her mother's name to illegally rent out a basement they did not own. "Chloe, baby, listen to me," Marcus said, taking a step toward her. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, slipping right back into his manipulative tone. "I did this for us. I was trying to build a foundation so you wouldn't have to work so hard. It was just a shortcut. We can fix this." Chloe looked up from the paper. The blind, Defensive loyalty she had shown at the cafe just a few days ago was completely gone. She looked at him with the exact same disgust that the wealthy investors had shown him. "You forged her name," Chloe whispered, taking a step back away from him. "You lied to the bank. You lied to the investors. You lied to me. You made me stand here and smile at these people while you used my mother's house to run a scam." "It is not a scam," Marcus begged, his face pale and sweating. "It is asset leverage. Everyone in real estate does it." "You don't own any real estate," Chloe screamed. The sound echoed off the canvas tent. "You don't own anything." "Marcus, this is her house." She threw the photograph onto the grass at his feet. She turned around, ran up the stairs, went into the house, and slammed the heavy glass patio door shut behind her. Marcus stood alone in the center of the ruined party. He looked down at the forged lease on the grass. Then, he looked up at me. I was still standing on the mahogany deck. I had not moved. I did not smile. I just looked at him. Grant closed his leather folder. He adjusted his suit jacket. 72 hours. "Marcus," Grant said smoothly, his voice cutting through the quiet afternoon air. "Starting right now. I suggest you go find some boxes." Grant delivered the 72-hour deadline, closed his heavy leather folder, and waited. In a power plant, after a massive, catastrophic system shutdown, there is a brief period called thermal shock. The massive steel pipes, suddenly deprived of the boiling high-pressure steam that usually runs through them, cool down so fast that they actually groan and buckle. I stood on the mahogany deck and watched my son-in-law experience thermal shock. The caterers did not ask him what to do with the leftover imported truffles. The waitstaff did not ask him for their final payment. They just quietly, efficiently packed up the silver trays, broke down the tables, and loaded their vans. To them, he was no longer a wealthy client. He was just a guy standing on a lawn, about to be evicted. I did not stay on the deck to watch him panic. I walked down the wooden stairs and joined Grant on the grass. But before we left the backyard, Grant had one more piece of paperwork. "You see, an eviction notice just removes the parasite. It does not recover the blood it already drank." Grant pulled a crisp, white envelope from his folder and handed it to Marcus. Marcus took it mechanically. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely break the seal. He pulled out the single sheet of paper. "That is a formal demand letter," Grant said, his voice completely devoid of any pity. "For the $43,200 in untaxed cash you illegally collected from my client's basement over the last 24 months. You have exactly 14 days to wire the entire amount into her trust account." Marcus looked up. His eyes were completely hollow. The slate-gray BMW parked in the driveway suddenly looked less like a status symbol and more like a massive, rolling debt. "If the money is not in that account by the deadline," Grant continued smoothly, "I will personally file civil charges for embezzlement. And I will hand the forged lease directly to the district attorney for criminal prosecution." "I don't have it," Marcus whispered, the absolute, unvarnished truth finally slipping out of his mouth. The arrogant facade was completely gone. "I put it all into Vanguard Horizon. It is tied up in the business accounts. I used it to secure the credit lines." Grant just adjusted his tailored suit jacket. "Then I highly suggest you start liquidating your fake empire." Grant and I walked out of the backyard, through the wooden gate, and down the long gravel driveway. We did not look back. I got into my 10-year-old pickup truck, drove back to my small apartment, and made myself a cup of Earl Grey tea. I did not call Chloe that night. I knew she was inside that house, finally looking at the man she married without the blinders on. She needed time to process the absolute demolition of her reality. I had to let the smoke clear. But the fire was still burning on Marcus's end. On Sunday afternoon, my phone rang. It was Marcus. I let it go straight to voicemail. He left a frantic, 4-minute message. He did not sound like a wealthy real estate magnate anymore. He sounded like a terrified little boy. He begged me to withdraw the eviction. He promised he would pay me back every single penny with interest. He said he just needed a little more time to close his new investment fund. He was still trying to bypass the safety switch. He still thought he could negotiate with the pressure gauge. I deleted the voicemail without listening to the end. When you build a financial empire entirely on perception, bad news travels faster than electricity. On Monday morning, the real avalanche started. Elena, the forensic auditor, called Grant and me with a status update. The tall, silver-haired investor, Richard, the man who had walked out of the party first, was incredibly well connected in the city's financial circles. By Sunday night, he had made a few phone calls to his peers. By Monday morning, Vanguard Horizon was completely toxic. Marcus's phone did not ring with new investors. It rang with furious clients demanding their capital back. But the real kill shot came right before lunch. The regional bank that had issued Marcus the massive $200,000 business line of credit, the loan he had secured using my property as fraudulent collateral, caught wind of the collapse. Banks do not like being lied to. They do not like forged assets. They invoked the default trigger. Elena confirmed it by 2 o'clock on Monday afternoon. The bank had frozen his business accounts pending a full review of his collateral. He could not move a single dollar. He could not pay his office rent. He could not even make the next payment on his heavy gold Rolex. His entire life had been powered by stolen equity and phantom voltage, and now the grid was entirely, permanently cold. In a power plant, when a catastrophic electrical fire breaks out in a main sector, you do not send engineers in with buckets of water. You seal the sector off completely. You close the heavy blast doors. You shut down the ventilation. And you starve the fire of oxygen until it completely burns itself out. Elena's package to the Internal Revenue Service was the heavy steel door slamming shut on Marcus's financial oxygen supply. Usually, a federal audit takes months to initiate. The government moves slowly, but Elena had not sent them. A vague suspicion or an anonymous tip, she had sent them a mathematically flawless, fully documented map of structured cash deposits, forged residential leases, and a fraudulent commercial loan application. She had handed them a pre-packaged felony, complete with 24 distinct signatures from the suspect. By 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, Marcus's air supply was completely cut off. I was sitting in my small kitchen, drinking a cup of hot Earl Grey tea, when Grant called me. "Patty," Grant said, his voice carrying a rare, quiet hint of satisfaction. "The dominoes are officially falling." "Tell me," I said, looking out the window at the bright morning sun. The regional bank completely locked Vanguard Horizon's accounts yesterday afternoon. Grant explained, but this morning, the federal government stepped in. Marcus went to his local branch downtown to try and withdraw cash from his personal checking account. The teller told him the account was flagged under a federal asset freeze to Devon.coms2 He is entirely locked out. I took a slow sip of my tea. The warmth spread evenly through my chest. "Did he try to call you?" I asked. "Oh," he called. Grant chuckled dryly. "He called my private office number about 10 minutes ago." He was not using that smooth, condescending investment manager tone anymore. He was practically hyperventilating. He demanded to know how I had the authority to freeze his business accounts. He threatened to sue me for corporate sabotage. He threatened to call the police. I let him rant for about 2 solid minutes. "And then what did you say?" I asked quietly. I told him I did not freeze his accounts. Grant replied, his voice dropping into that cold, surgical register he used in the courtroom. I told him the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service froze his accounts. I told him that structuring cash deposits to avoid currency transaction reports is a federal felony, carrying a maximum sentence of 5 years in a federal penitentiary per offense, and he has 24 distinct, documented offenses. The line went completely dead. He did not say another word. He just hung up the phone. When you build your entire identity around the perception of wealth, losing access to money is not just an inconvenience. It is a complete psychological collapse. The Internal Revenue Service does not care about your custom-tailored suits. They do not care about your high-net-worth networking parties. When they freeze an asset, they do it with absolute, terrifying efficiency. Every single bank account tied to Marcus's Social Security number and his corporate tax identification number was locked. His expensive credit cards were instantly declined. The massive $200,000 line of credit was completely recalled by the bank. The slate gray BMW, which was leased under the company name, was already flagged for immediate repossession. He could not buy a cup of coffee. He could not put gas in his car. The $43,200 he had stolen from my basement was entirely gone. At noon, my phone rang again. It was Chloe. I had not spoken to my daughter since Saturday afternoon. When she had run inside the house and slammed the heavy glass patio door, I answered on the second ring. "Mom?" Chloe said. Her voice was weak, hollow, and absolutely exhausted. She sounded like she had been crying for 3 days straight. "I am here." "Sweetheart," I said softly. "He is gone." Chloe whispered. "Marcus left." I set my teacup down on the counter. "Where did he go?" "I don't know," she said, her voice cracking. "He came home this morning looking like a ghost. He was sweating through his shirt. He said his firm was completely frozen. He said the federal government was investigating him for structuring cash. Mom?" He took a cheap gym duffel bag, threw some casual clothes into it, and drove away. He left his expensive suits in the closet. His heavy gold Rolex is still sitting on the nightstand. He said if he tried to pawn it, the government would track the transaction. He just ran. I did not feel a sudden surge of victory. I did not smile. I just felt the heavy, quiet finality of a machine that had finally stopped vibrating. "Chloe," I said, keeping my tone perfectly steady and clear, "listen to me very carefully. You did not sign that fraudulent lease. You did not structure those cash deposits. Your name is not on Vanguard Horizon. Legally, you are completely insulated from his federal crimes, but you need to file for a legal separation immediately, before the bank tries to attach his fraudulent debts to any joint accounts you might have." "I know," she sobbed softly. "I called a divorce attorney this morning. Mom, I am so sorry. I am so sorry." I defended him. "I called you a name on a piece of paper. I was so blind. You were holding onto a live wire." I said gently, "I just had to cut the power so you could finally let go." We talked for another 30 minutes. I told her that Grant would help her navigate the legal fallout. I told her she was safe. And I told her she could stay in the house, on the strict condition that she signed a legal, standard residential lease directly with me. There would be no more assumptions. There would be no more free rides. We were going to establish boundaries, because boundaries are the only foundation that can actually hold weight Tuesday evening. The 72-hour eviction notice officially expired. Marcus did not return to the property. He did not try to claim his belongings. The coward had simply abandoned his fake empire the second the lights went out. When you remove a massive, illegal bypass from a power grid, the system does not just go back to normal. It actually runs better. The baseline voltage stabilizes. The lights stop flickering. The heavy, angry hum in the walls completely disappears. By Wednesday morning, my house was finally quiet. At 10 o'clock, Chloe walked into Grant's downtown office. She did not look like the polished, arrogant woman who had sat across from me at the cafe just a few days earlier. She was wearing a simple, oversized gray sweater and dark jeans. Her eyes were red and swollen. She looked like a woman who had just survived a massive car crash and was finally stepping out of the wreckage. She sat down at the heavy mahogany conference table. Grant did not offer her a cup of expensive coffee. He did not offer any small talk. He simply opened his black leather folder and slid a thick stack of paper across the table. It was a standard, legally binding residential lease agreement. This is a month-to-month lease. Chloe, Grant said, his voice professional and entirely emotionally detached. The rent is exactly market rate for a 4-bedroom home in that neighborhood. $3,200 a month. Your mother is not subsidizing it. You are responsible for all utilities, all standard maintenance, and you are strictly prohibited from subletting any portion of the property, including the basement. Chloe looked down at the paperwork. Just a week ago, she would have rolled her eyes. She would have called it a dramatic insult. She would have reminded me that she was building a future and I was just a name on a piece of paper. Now, she just picked up the heavy brass pen. I understand. Chloe whispered. She signed her name on the bottom line. She reached into her purse, pulled out her personal checkbook, an account entirely separate from Vanguard Horizon, and wrote out the first month's rent, plus the security deposit. I sat across from her, watching her do it. I did not feel a rush of cruel victory. I did not feel the need to remind her how wrong she had been. I just felt a deep, profound sense of relief. My daughter was finally standing on her own 2 feet. It was going to be hard. And it was going to be painful. But it was going to be real. Chloe, I said softly, reaching across the table and resting my hand over hers. I love you. I will always be your mother. But I will never again be your silent bankroll. You are going to rebuild your life. And you are going to do it with absolute honesty. She nodded, tears quietly spilling over her eyelashes and dropping onto the polished wood of the table. I know. Mom, I know. After Chloe left to meet with her divorce attorney, Grant and I stayed in the conference room. Elena, the forensic auditor, called in on the speakerphone to give us the final update on the smoking ruins of my son-in-law's life. I tracked him down. Elena's voice crackled through the speaker. When Marcus ran yesterday morning, he didn't get very far. You cannot check into a nice hotel when every single credit card attached to your name is federally frozen. Where is he? Grant asked, leaning back in his chair. He is staying at a cheap, cash-only roadside motel on the very edge of the county line. Elena said, it costs $40 a night. He sold his custom golf clubs to a second-hand sports store just to get the cash to pay for the room. He is completely trapped. I pictured Marcus in my head. I pictured the man who had stood in my kitchen, wearing a custom cashmere sweater, shaving imported truffles onto a prime steak while feeding me a $3 vanilla wafer. I pictured the man who had stood under a white canvas tent, raising a crystal champagne flute, telling 50 millionaires that he was a master of asset leverage. Now, he was sitting on a stained mattress in a $40 motel room, hiding from the federal government. "What about his investors?" I asked. "Oh, they are circling like vultures," Elena replied. "The silver-haired man, Richard, filed a massive civil suit against Vanguard Horizon this morning for fraudulent misrepresentation. Several other investors joined the lawsuit before noon. But honestly, it is entirely symbolic at this point. They are suing a ghost. There is absolutely no money left to take. The Internal Revenue Service has first claim on whatever pennies are left in those accounts, and they are not going to leave a single dime. The $43,200 he had stolen from my basement was just the spark. The federal audit was the inferno. Marcus was going to spend the next 5 to 10 years fighting criminal charges, drowning in legal fees he could not afford, and facing actual, physical prison time. "Are we done here, Patty?" Grant asked quietly, looking across the table at me. I thought about the digital lock he had drilled into my basement door. I thought about the heavy, vibrating hum of the overloaded breaker box. "Yes, Grant," I said, picking up my purse. "We are completely done. You can close the file." In a power plant, when a catastrophic failure is finally contained, the ugliest part of the job begins. We call it clearing the wreckage. You have to put on heavy boots, walk into the burned-out sector, and manually haul away the scorched wire and the melted steel. It is dirty, quiet, and unglamorous work, but you cannot bring the grid back online until every single piece of the ruined system is physically removed from the building. My son-in-law was the wreckage, and on Thursday morning, it was time to clear him out. 3 days had passed since Marcus fled to that cheap, cash-only motel on the edge of the county line, but he had left in a panic, taking only a small duffel bag of casual clothes, his custom-tailored suits, his imported leather shoes, and his heavy gold Rolex were still sitting in the master bedroom of my house. He desperately needed those things, not to wear them, but to sell them. His bank accounts were entirely frozen by the federal government. His credit cards were useless. He needed to pawn his own wardrobe just to afford a criminal defense attorney. But because the 72-hour eviction notice had officially expired, and because Chloe had formally filed her legal separation papers, Marcus could not just walk through the front door. He had lost his keys. He had lost his access. If he wanted his clothes, he had to request a civil standby, a police escort. It was raining that morning. It was a cold, steady, unforgiving autumn rain that turned the fallen leaves in the yard into a slick pit. Heavy-paced. I was standing in the living room, holding a warm mug of Earl Grey tea. Looking out the large front window, Chloe was standing a few feet away, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. At exactly 10 o'clock, a white and black local police cruiser slowly pulled into my long gravel driveway. Right behind the cruiser was a beat-up, faded yellow taxicab. Marcus's slate-gray BMW had already been repossessed by the bank the day before. A uniformed police officer stepped out of the cruiser and put on his rain hat. Then, the rear door of the taxi opened. Marcus stepped out into the rain. He did not have an umbrella. He was wearing the same wrinkled gray sweatshirt and dark jeans he had been wearing for 3 days. He walked to the trunk of the taxi and pulled out a massive, hard-shell rolling suitcase. I watched him walk up the concrete sidewalk. The man who had stood under a white canvas tent just 5 days ago, sipping imported champagne and calling himself a master of real estate, was now entirely unrecognizable. His shoulders were hunched against the cold. His hair was plastered flat against his forehead, He was wearing a pair of expensive, light brown Italian suede loafers. They were the kind of shoes meant for carpeted boardrooms and valet parking. As he dragged his heavy suitcase up the walkway, he stepped right into a puddle of thick, dark mud. The dirty water soaked instantly into the expensive suede, ruining them completely. He did not even stop to wipe them off. He just kept walking, dragging the plastic wheels of the suitcase through the wet leaves. The police officer knocked on the front door. I set my teacup down on the console table and opened the door. "Ma'am," the officer said politely, nodding his head. "I am here on a civil standby. This gentleman has 20 minutes to collect his personal clothing and toiletries. I will be supervising him the entire time to ensure nothing else is removed from the property." "Thank you, officer," I said quietly. I stepped back and held the door open. Marcus walked into the foyer. He smelled like damp wool, stale sweat, and cheap motel soap. He did not look me in the eye. He stared firmly at the hardwood floor. He looked up just once, catching sight of Chloe standing near the staircase. His face twisted into a pathetic, desperate expression. He opened his mouth, perhaps to beg, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to spin one final impossible lit. Chloe did not let him speak. "You have 20 minutes, Marcus," Chloe said. Her voice was not angry. It was just completely, utterly empty. "Get your things." Marcus swallowed hard. He lowered his head, grabbed the handle of his suitcase, and walked up the stairs with the police officer following right behind him. For the next 15 minutes, the house was silent, except for the heavy thud of footsteps on the second floor. We heard the frantic sliding of closet doors. We heard the harsh, metallic sound of a suitcase zipper being forced closed. When Marcus finally came back down the stairs, he was struggling. The heavy plastic suitcase was overstuffed, bulging at the seams. In his left hand, he was tightly clutching the heavy gold Rolex, holding on to it like a life preserver in a freezing ocean. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs. He looked around the beautiful, warm house that he had lived in for 5 years, absolutely free. He looked at the marble kitchen island. He looked at the mahogany deck visible through the back window. He finally looked at me. He wanted to say something arrogant. I could see it in his eyes. He wanted to tell me that he was going to bounce back, that he was going to build a new empire, that I had made a massive mistake. The backup generators of his ego were trying desperately to fire one last time, but he had no fuel left. He was a man facing 5 federal felony charges for structuring cash, standing in a puddle of water dripping from his own ruined shoes. He let out a shaky breath, turned around, and walked out the front door. I stood in the doorway and watched him go. The heavy plastic wheels of his suitcase jammed on a clump of wet, muddy leaves on the driveway. He yanked it hard, but it wouldn't roll. He had to physically drag the heavy bag across the wet gravel, the plastic scraping harshly against the stones. He opened the door of the cheap yellow taxi, threw his bag into the back seat, and climbed in. The taxi reversed out of the driveway, followed closely by the police cruiser. They turned the corner and disappeared into the gray rain. I closed the front door. The lock clicked into place with a solid, satisfying sound. The wreckage was gone. The house was finally clean. A week later, Gary came back to the house. He did not come for an emergency call this time. He came to do the permanent, surgical removal of Marcus's illegal bypass. I stood in the basement and watched my old friend work. He brought a heavy steel crowbar and a sledgehammer, and we systematically tore open the ceiling tiles and the cheap drywall Marcus had used to hide his dangerous electrical wiring. When Gary finally pulled the thick, overloaded bundle of black wires out from the main wooden joist. He just shook his head. The plastic insulation was visibly charred. It was brittle and cracked. It had been mere inches away from catching the dry wood on fire. Marcus had been perfectly willing to burn my entire property down and risk the life of the young medical student living there, just to keep his fake cash flow running. We spent the entire afternoon ripping out every single piece of unauthorized copper. We disconnected the heavy kitchen appliances, capped the wires, and completely terminated the rogue circuits. When Gary walked upstairs and finally flipped the main breaker back on, the house was perfectly, beautifully silent. The angry, vibrating hum in the walls was completely gone. The electrical pressure was gone. The grid was entirely restored. I actually paid Liam, the medical student, his last month of rent back out of my own pocket as a moving gift. He found a safe, legal, fully permitted apartment much closer to his hospital. He was a good kid who just got caught up in a bad man's scam. And I wanted to make sure he landed on his feet. Chloe is landing on her feet. 2. It has been exactly 1 month since Marcus was escorted out of my driveway by the local police. And the transformation in my daughter is incredible. She looks rested. The deep, heavy exhaustion that used to sit behind her eyes is completely gone. She is no longer working 60 hours a week just to fund her husband's delusions of grandeur. She got a promotion at her corporate job. And every single month, on the first day of the month, she writes me a check for $3,200. We have coffee together on Sunday mornings. We talk. We laugh. Our relationship is healthier now than it has been in 5 years. Because it is finally built on a foundation of mutual respect, not silent obligation. I am no longer just a name on a piece of paper to her. I am her mother, and she is my tenant. The boundaries saved us. As for Marcus, the silence from his end is absolute. Grant told me that Vanguard Horizon Properties is officially completely dissolved. The federal government seized whatever tiny scraps of capital were left in the business accounts to cover his massive tax penalties. He is currently facing 24 separate federal felony charges for structuring cash deposits, along with severe civil penalties for the fraudulent bank loan. He is not hosting networking parties anymore. He is not pouring imported champagne for millionaires. He is spending his days sitting in a cheap public defender's office, trying to figure out how to avoid spending the next 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The man who thought he owned the world lost absolutely everything, simply because he forgot who built the ground he was standing on. I am sitting on the mahogany deck right now. It is a beautiful, crisp Tuesday morning. The sun is shining through the tall oak trees in the backyard. I have a hot cup of Earl Grey tea in my hand. My old, beat-up pickup truck is parked in the driveway, exactly where it belongs. There are no canvas tents. There are no caterers. There is just peace. In a power plant, you learn very quickly that you cannot cheat the system. You cannot bypass the safety switches and expect the machine to run forever. The pressure always finds a way out. Trust exploited in the shadows will always be brought to light. You can wire a house with lies, but eventually, the breaker trips. And when the lights come back on, everyone sees you for exactly what you are. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If you believe respect has to be earned, not assumed, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next